We begin tonight with a conflict between Hezbollah and Israel. Israeli leaders have stepped up their rhetoric in recent days, warning that the army is preparing for an offensive along the northern border with Lebanon. The Iran-backed militant group Hezbollah began firing rockets at Israel immediately after the Hamas terror attacks last October. Now, in recent weeks, attacks have increased, with Hezbollah rockets sparking massive wildfires in northern Israel. Many of the homes close to the border have been evacuated for months due to the conflict. Tens of thousands of people who fled the region have no idea when they will be able to return home. Now, the Israeli government is under increasing pressure to restore security in northern Israel. But does that mean an escalation in the conflict with Hezbollah is imminent? Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu visited areas affected by the fires today and issued a clear warning to Hezbollah.
Anyone who thinks they can hurt us and we will sit idly by, they're making a big mistake. We are prepared for a very intense operation in the north. One way or another, we will restore security to the north.
I'm joined now by political analyst and commentator Ronnie Shatta in Beirut. He's the host of the Beirut Banyan podcast, which covers modern Lebanese history. Ronnie, so good to have you on the show. Now, Netanyahu says that Israel is prepared to act against Hezbollah. How are those comments being viewed in Lebanon?
For better or worse, this type of tension along the Lebanese-Israeli border is familiar terrain. And this isn't the first time an Israeli prime minister has threatened further escalation. I think it's also important to remember that since October 8, a day after the October 7 tragedy began, Hezbollah's calculations in South Lebanon against Israeli interests in northern Israel have also been extremely cautious. So my assessment is that despite the bluster, despite the threats, this is still careful, calculated, to a degree escalation, but nothing that's not familiar. The reason I'm using this word is because for a long time now, for decades, South Lebanon has been a battlefield. At times it's quiet, at times it's like today, which means there's a battlefield that's being leveraged. Now, how it's being leveraged is a story in itself. But Hezbollah's calculations in 2024 are very different than Hezbollah's calculations in the 1990s, or for that matter in 2006. I think one of caution, is actually extending, despite it being 8 months into this conflict.
And how has Hezbollah changed over the years, and where does it stand now?
That's a great question. Hezbollah's influence in Lebanon is at an all-time high. Hezbollah's leverage against Israel is at an all-time low. And the reason I frame it this way is because today, Iran's interests in Lebanon are more important than Hezbollah's local affairs, or even for that matter, Hezbollah's own calculated interests. Iran does not seem willing to let go of its crown jewel. And its crown jewel is Hezbollah, and Hezbollah's leverage from Lebanon. It seems up until now, despite this group having an enormous amount of sway and influence on local Lebanese affairs, and despite it being able to, at times, veto political decisions that have less to do with its security decision-making, and despite its capabilities that are known to Lebanese, Hezbollah's actions against Israel are unfamiliar, being that this is the Palestinian cause, this is the raison d'etre for this sub-state militia in Lebanon, and has been acting extremely, I'll use this word carefully, pragmatic. Pragmatic for a militia, not pragmatic for any other Lebanese political party. This is a group that stands on its own in Lebanon, and that it has sub-state military capabilities. But Hezbollah right now, despite the escalation, despite the threats from the Israeli side, and you're right, Netanyahu is threatening action. Up until now, it seems like, for better or worse, this is the usual in Lebanon.
Yeah. Tell us more about Hezbollah's ideology. And it's viewed as a terrorist organization, at least in part, by the U.S., by Germany, and several other countries. So what does Hezbollah want, and how far have they been willing to go until now to get it?
I appreciate that question. I think it's a complicated question. And what Hezbollah wants on local Lebanese issues may not always match what Iran wants from Hezbollah. But up until October 7, 2024, to put it in perspective, the South was fairly quiet. to the point that a maritime deal was negotiated between Lebanon and Israel, of course, indirectly, but Hezbollah was on board. We have a maritime deal with the Israelis. That's the kind of climate Hezbollah can succeed in as well. So I doubt right now the interests for Hezbollah is an all-out war with Israel. It seems more like what Iran needs from that group, and what it needs may not actually be at the same time what Lebanon can handle. And the reason I say that also is because the Lebanese economy crashed. Lebanese politics is paralyzed. We haven't had a president for the better part of nearly 2 years, if not more. We have a caretaker prime minister, we have a caretaker government, and we have a country that's increasingly unfamiliar in terms of safety. Local violence is on the rise. This may not be good for Hezbollah long term, but it may actually be better for Iran in the short term, meaning that they have gained something which is quite unusual. A sub-state militia in Lebanese politics that's manage Lebanon's security, help save the Assad regime from crumbling, train Iraqi sub-state militias, and get involved in Yemen when necessary, in addition to all the other stories that come out from this group in South America via drug trade, and everything at how a proxy militia can survive 34 years after the civil war ended at an all-time high for its weaponry, for its survivability. So it's an unusual circumstance. I think at the end of the day, it's the Lebanese state that pays the heaviest toll because this state is wobbling today.
Yeah. Now, with these threats coming out of Israel and you know the battlefield that you talked about before in the south heating up more and more since October 7th or 8th, the day after, an all-out war is on people's mind. And Hezbollah went to war with Israel in 2006. I want to know from you what impact that had on Lebanon.
2006 did several things. It showed that Hezbollah can, if it deems necessary, cross the border and kidnap Israeli soldiers and kill a few as well, and enter a month-long conflict with Israel that is now referred to as the July War. It can also accept, under duress, a Security Council resolution like 1701. And 1701 ended that war. It created the ceasefire that still exists today, on paper at least, but it's a resolution that enhances Lebanese sovereignty, at least on paper. And 1701 also did other things. It expanded UNIFIL's presence. UNIFIL begins in 1978 under Resolution 425. In 2006, we have 1701 that, if I'm not mistaken, threefold increase in UNIFIL troop presence in the south. And it also did something which I don't think Hezbollah wanted then, in terms of how the war played out, is that the Lebanese army, for the first time since the civil war, returned to the south. Prior to 2006, there was no Lebanese army presence in South Lebanon, despite Israel's withdrawal in May 2000. So the Lebanese army is there. UNIFIL is there, and Hezbollah is there right now. And if you fast forward, it seems like the terms of engagement, meaning how this plays out in the long term vis-a-vis Hezbollah and Israel, are being honed in. I doubt this is a call for all-out war. This is actually more familiar of how ceasefires were conducted in the 1990s, and it's less to do with 2006. And the reason I say that is because Hezbollah is not under duress the way it was in August 2006, when 1701 was acceptable to Hezbollah. Hezbollah's favor, actually, this time around, is one of leverage, I think, and enhancing maybe what Iran would like to get out of a regional deal that has yet to emerge.
How big is, of course, you know, Iran is Hezbollah's biggest backer. How big is their leverage? Does Hezbollah do whatever Iran says, or are there frictions among leaderships? And can Hezbollah say, you know, this is a bridge too far, this is not something that we're willing to do? How far can they work in their own accord?
Great question. There are local issues that matter to that group in Lebanon and don't really matter to Iran. And there may actually be at times friction from security apparatuses you wouldn't imagine, whether it's Iran or even the Assad regime. Actually, to go all the way here, the Assad regime, as it regains control in Syria, may not always see eye to eye with Hezbollah's presence in Syria and may seek leverage once more in Lebanon. That may not be satisfactory to Hezbollah, maybe to Iran long term. So there is always a natural friction. But in terms of the capabilities and the military interests and the security of the Iranian regime, Hezbollah is 100% in alignment. On the Lebanese front, I don't think Hezbollah is happy with the economic crash. I don't think Hezbollah is happy with the presidential vacuum. It may not be happy that its pick for the president has not been acceptable, but that's, I think, local friction that maybe Iran may nudge Hezbollah to reconsider. But at the end of the day, local interests for that group and how it survives among other Lebanese actors that are disarmed, that I think is Hezbollah's terrain, less what Iran looks at when it comes to Lebanon. But in the bigger picture, it is clear this is Iran's mirror reflection. It is a sub-state group that manages. It is born out of the 1980s. It increases rather than decreases its presence. It becomes sophisticatedly involved in regional wars that play out largely in Iran's favor. And it seems to be shielded for the time being, shielded from international curiosity and how to end this kind of nightmare, at least when it comes to the Lebanese geographic battlefield that unfortunately for too long, we as a people have been paying a price for.
Yeah. How has this latest uptake in violence and in tension, especially in the south, been experienced by communities living on the Lebanese side of the border?
Over 100,000 southern Lebanese are out of their homes. South Lebanon is a war zone, even though it is so familiar to be in the capital of Lebanon, in Beirut, and almost feel like you're not in a war zone, but then you're reminded with flyovers, with the sound on occasion of a sonic boom, or for that matter, more recently, watching the news of something that's happening kilometers away. There is a serious concern that this could escalate at any time, but it's a stark difference from 2006, when overnight, Lebanon was engaged. It's almost its entire geography engaged in war. Bridges being bombed, power plants being bombed, institutions breaking down in the middle of war, and of course, over 1 million southern Lebanese pushed out of their homes that summer. It has not reached that level yet. But I agree with the premise in that the threat of escalation should be taken seriously, even when, up until now, it doesn't seem like Iran wants a full-out war, but they should be taken seriously. And for that reason alone, international engagement should be focused on how to end this nightmare rather than kicking the can down the road, which seems to be the preferred stabilization policies that keeps Lebanon a battlefield, but brings back a semblance of quiet for years until the next round of war.
That was Ronnie Shattah in Beirut. Thank you so much for those fascinating and very thoughtful insights.
My pleasure.